Sandra Johnson Hughes was born on the 26th of July 1966 and was 54 years old when she went missing in the Sierra National Forest located in California in July of 2020. Before the global events of 2020 with lockdowns and such, Sandra lived in Hawaii, but that year, perhaps because of all the craziness that was happening, she moved back to the mainland, settling in California just a month before her disappearance. Sandra had been described as living something of a nomadic lifestyle, in the sense that she'd travelled the country and lived in various places over the years. She hadn't lived in Hawaii long enough for her to consider it home, which is a good thing I suppose, as that must have made it easier to move to California. For all of us, especially at the start of 2020, this was a deeply concerning period of time, and we were quickly learning that quarantine and the virus itself weren't going away anytime soon. Sandra was thinking carefully about how she wanted to handle this situation while still living a fulfilling life. Her life had not gone completely to plan up until this point. She'd been through 2 divorces and didn't have any children, but she was known to love the outdoors and was a seasoned camper and survivalist. She was very fit for her age and would go on frequent solo hikes in remote and wilderness areas, so this was an activity that she had a fair bit of experience in. Speaking of which, during her college years, she placed a focus on outdoor recreation, which was her passion, and I believe she wanted to become a park ranger. This didn't really work out, but thankfully she was an intelligent person that had a skill with maths, so became an accountant. From what I can gather, Sandra seems to have been very much the kind of person who was highly independent. Given the state of the world at that time, and all the restrictions that were in place, after sorting out living arrangements and moving into a new home, she saw an opportunity and decided that it was the perfect time to go on a solo hiking trip. From her perspective, this was a great chance to break free from the reality of lockdowns and constant worry, to getting back out there and embracing nature. Sometime in June, she had sold her home in Maui and finalised her move to her new home in Madeira. This brings us to the 26th of June that year, when she called her family on the phone and told them that she was going on this camping trip in the Sierra National Forest, and potentially hiking all the way up north towards Yosemite. She then told them that she'd be back in touch with them in the coming weeks after she was finished. The actual date that she'd entered the forest is not clear, but at some point after this call was made and her plans were laid out to her family, she'd packed her camping gear and drove to the Sierra National Forest. She'd gone fairly deep too, as she'd passed the Fresno Dome area. Beyond that, she eventually came off and onto a rough, uneven trail that snaked through the woods until it led her to Johnson Meadows. There's no wonder why she might have chosen this place. It's a picturesque spot where beyond the field it's bordered by dense forest, and in the distance there is a great view of the mountains. With this kind of environment, it doesn't come without its risks. Outside of the meadow, it's a very rugged area, and because of how remote it is, there are known to be bears and cougars that live in this place. After parking the car, she got out and collected her things and began setting up camp somewhere in the meadows. Again, it's not clear exactly when she entered the forest and when she set up camp. We only know that it was either on or sometime after the 26th, but the Madera County Sheriff's Office received a report on the 2nd of July that a group of hikers had found an abandoned campsite at Johnson Meadows. This group had been hiking the area and they noticed the camp, so wanted to give whoever it belonged to some privacy and gave the site some distance as they travelled around it. But someone in the group noticed that it looked like it had been abandoned, and so they headed over. This campsite was none other than Sandra's. The tent was described as being only half set up or had collapsed for some reason, and her camping gear and supplies had been strewn around the place. It was just an absolute mess, and although this group didn't really know what to think about this, thankfully they did understand well enough that this visual was unusual and worth reporting to the authorities. It's not clear what they might have been thinking, perhaps an animal could have gotten to it or something else, but they weren't sure. The sheriff's office came down on that very day, the 2nd, where they found the camp and came across personal belongings and identification that had also been scattered around. So then they made contact with Sandra's family to explain what they'd found. In their official reports, they noted that the campsite was in disarray and bags had been emptied and that it was just an overall mess. The timeline of this incident is also a bit of a mess online, as various sources have reported conflicting dates. but I've done what I can to try and piece it together. During the conversation between the authorities and Sandra's family, they learned that Sandra was an environmentally friendly person and was very neat, organised, and had a great deal of respect for nature and the outdoors. So everyone knew well enough that she wouldn't have just left a place like that for no reason. Rather, something must have gone quite badly wrong here. The family also told the sheriff that they hadn't heard from Sandra since the phone call on the 26th of June, so everyone involved had absolutely no idea where she'd gone from the meadows. The missing persons report was now officially in, and a major search operation had been launched to get in there and bring Sandra home. Over the course of the next 2 days, there were hundreds of people that entered the forest performing grid searches. Helicopters fitted with thermal imaging cameras were placed in the skies above, and search dogs were brought in. Now, on the 4th, 2 days after the scene at the camp was discovered, there was a definitive, positive sighting of Sandra. This would mark, potentially, the very last time that she would ever be seen. Now, there is some confusion around this sighting, as many claim that it occurred around Johnson Meadows, but this seems to be wrong. The actual position of this sighting was the Chiquito Pass trailhead. Now, this is Chiquito Lake, and this is the very spot that I believe she was seen. Whatever the case may be, there were oddities to this encounter. The group of hikers stated that she was barefoot and had a bruise on her face. She was wearing a black shirt and blue jeans, and this group had stated to the officers that they offered her assistance, but she declined. They said that she was just standing around and wondered if she was waiting for someone. They said that she didn't appear to be distressed, and aside from the bruise, there was nothing apparent in the way that she was acting that made them feel like she needed help. I can imagine that from their perspective. As far as they were concerned, they just came across a person that was minding her own business, and so they continued on their way. Now, this wasn't the only unusual report, and as said, there is some confusion surrounding the timeline. On the 5th, authorities discovered that Sandra's car, a silver Saab, was on a stump in a ravine approximately here, 6 miles north of her abandoned campsite. Now, because the car was found on the 5th, some believe that it also crashed on the 5th, the day after the sighting by the hikers. However, it appears that this crash likely happened the day before and still on the 4th, before she was spotted at the trailhead. Various sources mention that a park spokesman said that Sandra refused assistance from other motorists, though it's not specifically stated that anyone had seen her crash. The series of events happening in this order may also help to explain the bruising present on her face. Whoever had been driving the car, Sandra, I assume, had not been driving recklessly at a high speed, but rather the car had hit the tree at a speed of less than 20 miles per hour. After the collision, the car slid down into the ravine. Again, while this could have resulted in the bruising to her face, it's not immediately clear that the speed of the impact led to any significant injuries beyond that, as there was no evidence of that left behind in the car. We know for a fact that the airbags did not deploy, so the accident is likely not to have been high impact. And again, from what has been said, 20 miles per hour is the absolute maximum speed it could have been, so it may have been a bit less than that. So, to try and get this in order, it seems that the camp had been discovered on the 2nd, then days later on the 4th. I imagine first she struck the tree with her car, again perhaps resulting in the bruising, and then a short time later being seen by the hikers wandering at the trailhead, now barefoot for some reason. Given that appears to be the case, the unusual behaviour and weirdness actually seems to have started on the 2nd, or sometime before that even, with her campsite. It's not known how long her campsite had been left in disarray and abandoned before its discovery. It's not even clear that Sandra herself was responsible for the mess left behind at the camp. Could there have been a person who held particularly bad intentions that drove her out? Could an animal have caused her to flee? It's just not known. We know that Sandra was a neat and tidy person. She had a lot of experience in wilderness areas and she knew what she was doing. So how did the camp become to be in such disarray? The world was a crazy place at that time. Could it be possible that it affected her quite badly and she had suffered from some kind of mental break? She could have made her way to the parked car from the campsite, still suffering from this break, drove north while being completely disoriented, hit the tree, and then wandered out again into the wilderness. It's not really clear what was going on there. Or as others have mentioned, you could look at it another way. A separate event took place at the campsite that caused her to flee, whether an animal or something else. She scrambled to the car as the campsite was being torn through by something, and then she drove 6 miles north and hit the tree. I'm not sure that's really the case though. If Sandra had been threatened, or felt threatened, it would have made far more sense to have driven south in the direction of her home, not further north and deeper into the forest. Now, it's important to note that none of these people who'd seen her on the 4th, that being the motorists nor the hikers, realised that anyone was missing in the area. However, the group of hikers that had spotted her at the trailhead later realised that she'd been reported missing days before once they reached the car park after their hike was over. When they got there, they'd seen the missing person flyers that had been put up that very day containing a picture of Sandra and explaining that she was missing. I'm sure at that moment it must have clicked, and they realised that the woman with the blue hair who was just standing in the forest near the trail was Sandra Hughes. They then called the sheriff's office, which must have been great news to the sheriff all things considered, but when they got out there they weren't able to find her and there were no obvious indications as to where she might have gone. Now, back to the car. On the 5th, sometime during the afternoon, the sheriff's department confirmed that her silver Saab 95 was found in the ravine, and as mentioned, 6 miles to the north of the campsite. Similar to the campsite, when the authorities investigated the car, they noticed something unusual. Sandra's belongings had been taken from the vehicle and the items had been strewn around outside the car on the forest floor. Almost as if Sandra, or someone, had been rummaging through the car looking for something and throwing things out. Weirdly, this was a similar finding as to what had taken place at the campsite, though again, what led to the campsite mess in the first place is not clear. In the same vein as my speculations about her state of mind at the time, the sheriff's office believed that she was not actively trying to evade or stay hidden from the police, but instead was probably highly disoriented. The idea that they were operating on seems to have been that the crash likely caused her state of mind at the time, and perhaps some kind of injury such as a concussion had impaired her cognitively to the point that she was not able to think clearly. You could dispute parts of that though. While obviously the crash cannot have helped the situation in any way, and to be fair, certainly could have made things worse, there was clearly something awry days before that incident as per the scene at the campsite. Now, it is possible that on the 2nd, her state of mind hadn't deteriorated and she was in fact fleeing and fearful of someone, but there isn't any evidence of that. There were, and still are, discussions surrounding the involvement of foul play, but for the most part it seems that the authorities discounted them. Whatever the case may be, by this time on the 5th, a major search for her had already been underway over the previous days. The decision was taken to leave the car where it was, as this might have been used as a landmark for her to find her way. To help with this, law enforcement left instructions and important numbers for her to call for help on the windshield, just in case she came back. Ashley Marcus was Sandra's niece, and she was effectively campaigning online for support for this disappearance. It seems that she wanted Sandra found ASAP, and through social media was helping to keep the spotlight on the incident by providing updates and further information. She confirmed that both the state of the car and campsite was similar in terms of how dishevelled the scene was, in regards to her items being scattered around. She also confirmed that both of the scenes were highly unusual and completely out of character for Sandra, as litter bothered her, especially in areas like this. As you can imagine, the authorities, alongside professional search and rescue teams, first began to scour the area in the vicinity of the car, and then fanned out into the tree lines from there. This effort did actually uncover something around 2.5 miles to 3 miles north of the car. There, not far from Spotted Lakes, which is right on the border of Yosemite, they found a sleeping bag that they identified as belonging to Sandra. This discovery was made on the 12th of July, or 8 days after Sandra was last seen. This area was not easy to get to, there were no roads or trails in the area, and they wondered just how she'd even managed to traverse this kind of terrain. They said that it looked like the sleeping bag had been slept in recently, so they scoured the whole area around the sleeping bag and around Spotted Lakes. But the searchers, nor the dogs, or any other means at their disposal could find even a hint of her. The circumstances puzzled the searchers, who made a note of the fact that it's as if she'd been travelling directly north in a straight line towards Yosemite National Park, which she did say she might do in the phone call on the 26th of June to her family. They also realised though, that it appeared that she'd been travelling without any supplies at all, nor any shoes. This is important because it begs the question, once you've gone without your shoes, just how far can you actually get? Presumably, in rugged terrain like this, you might think that alone would limit your movement. There was an intensive search that went on for 7 days at the location of the sleeping bag, but after repeatedly finding nothing, on the 19th, the search was scaled down to a limited, continuous search. The dogs at no point found any indication of her scent anywhere. Other than the potential sighting of Sandra by the 2 hikers on the 4th of July, there were only 2 other reported sightings. The first one seems plausible but unlikely, while the second alleged sighting ventures into the realm of the extraordinary. The initial sighting occurred on the 9th of August, just over a month after her deserted campsite was discovered. 2 hunters were driving down this isolated road here, and as they got down there, they reported that they saw a woman alone, leaning against a tree along the road, close to Chiquito Creek and Portuguese Overlook. Meaning, if this was in fact her, then she'd somehow been alive for over a month without any supplies at all. Not only that, but from the point of her sleeping bag, she had travelled 5 miles back to the southeast, nearer to the sightings of her on the 4th of July. Now, these hunters knew that this was odd, because this was a very remote place and not somewhere you'd be expecting to see anyone. Some reports state that these men drove away not thinking anything was actually wrong with her, and others state that they tried to flag her down and speak to her, but she just ignored them and then they just carried on their way. Whatever the case may be, later on during the day, upon their return to town, they saw the missing posters picturing Sandra Hughes and immediately realised that Sandra was the person that they'd seen earlier. They were absolutely convinced that it was Sandra that they'd encountered in the forest. At that point, the hunters informed the authorities and told them what happened. They said that the woman did not signal for help, make eye contact, or look distressed. She simply appeared to be taking a rest, resembling a typical hiker on a break. They stated that she appeared noticeably thinner than in her last known photographs and seemed to be alone, without any gear. Strangely, it was also reported that the woman was wearing a floral shirt underneath overalls, meaning that if this was Sandra, she'd also somehow managed to change clothing, despite having left everything behind earlier. The Madera County Sheriff's Office investigated that location but found no evidence of Sandra's presence. All of the sightings of her were reported in areas affected by the creek fire that started on the 4th of September 2020 in Fresno and Madera counties, and the fire wasn't fully contained until late December. Officials confirmed that Sandra's car was not damaged by the fire and had been retrieved since it appeared that Sandra was not going to return to it, though the date that it was hauled away is not clear to me. If the hunter's sighting is to be considered credible, is it possible that she was living out there until the fires took place? If that sighting was in fact Sandra, it was around a month out from when the wildfires started, so is there a chance that she could have been around during that? Given the complexity of Sandra's last known whereabouts and the ruggedness of the terrain, the search efforts in the Sierra National Forest were immensely complicated throughout this entire effort. The forest encompasses over 1.3 million acres, and this vast expanse of land is both awe-inspiring and unforgiving in its various regions. Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's campsite was found, sits centrally within the forest. Considering just how large and dense the forests are, it's not a surprise that someone could become lost. However, in Sandra's case, it seems that there's more to consider. As we know, Sandra was described as an avid outdoor enthusiast and survivalist, including her studies to become a park ranger. She would have known not only how to stay safe in this kind of environment, but also how to navigate this type of terrain. While the sighting by the hunters seems credible enough, it still seems questionable. Surviving alone without gear, food or help, possibly suffering from a head injury for such a long time is unlikely. This sighting was truly baffling. However, it's not the strangest one, so if we haven't already, let's get bizarre. Fast forward a year to the 21st of July 2021, Jake and Victoria Gorber were visiting the Sierra National Forest with their 3 children. At the time, Jake had an off-road vehicle that he was using to traverse the steep roads in the middle of the forest, and they were heading to Shut-Eye Peak. This is a mountain that offers amazing views and is connected to its sibling, Little Shut-Eye Peak. As they were driving up the mountain, they decided to stop for lunch. Thankfully for them, they were able to find a flat portion of the road where they could relax comfortably for a while. Next to the road, there was a small meadow surrounded by dense forestry where they pulled over, and they were about to go have a picnic. As they were preparing to leave the car, Jake and Victoria stated that their 3-year-old son, Caden, was looking out of the window next to him in the back seat, and he began talking to someone or something in the direction of the meadow. He was just turned and facing towards the window, seemingly having a conversation with someone. Apart from themselves and Caden's siblings, there was no one else present, and the parents just stared off into the meadow, which was on the clearing on the mountain. The exact area is not clear, but this spot was about 5 miles south of Johnson Meadow. Initially, they dismissed it as typical toddler curiosity, and they carried on with preparing lunch. However, once they were ready to get out and go, they noticed that Caden was still intensely gazing out the car window, prompting Victoria to inquire about what he was looking at. She said, "Caden, who are you talking to?" What followed sent shivers down her spine. While pointing towards the meadow, Caden said, "There's a lady over in the meadow in a black shirt. She needs our help, but she's not alive. And she's lying face down with her legs up, and she can't talk to me, but she's over there, and we need to go help her." His demeanour and just how weird this was compelled the family to humour what was going on for a moment, but they told him that they couldn't see anyone out there. Caden told them that they needed to trust him and that this woman was lying face down right over there as he pointed out towards the meadow. Jake got out of the car to see what Caden was pointing at, and he had a good look around trying to search for this woman, but he couldn't find anyone. He came back to the car, and I get the sense that this just kind of unsettled everyone, and a sense of creepiness lingered in the air, prompting an early departure from their trip, and they drove back down the mountain wanting to be out of there. Victoria later shared the incident on Facebook, unaware of its significance to Sandra's case. Unexpectedly, the Madera County Deputy Sheriff, Chris Williams, stumbled upon Victoria's post, instantly recognising the detailed description of the woman as a match for Sandra. Victoria was taken aback when Deputy Williams reached out to her, but as she learned more about Sandra's disappearance, Caden's account began to align with the circumstances. Recalling Caden's uncanny accuracy in describing Sandra's appearance down to her distinctive blue hair, Victoria was astonished. She told WSET News he was very adamant that we needed to help her, and he described her right down to her blue hair. He said that she had a black shirt, blue jeans and blue hair, and that's the exact description of her when she went missing. The police gave Caden a lineup, and he was able to recognise Sandra in 3 of the 4 photos, identifying her as the woman he'd seen in the meadow. The following day, Caden and his father accompanied the county sheriff back to the mountain to investigate further. Despite their efforts, the search once again uncovered absolutely nothing, and even now years later, Sandra's final whereabouts remain unknown. There are a couple of hypotheses in regards to Sandra's disappearance and what may have happened to her. When authorities were conducting the initial search, based on what was found in the car, there was no evidence to suggest Sandra suffered a severe injury that would have led to her passing away there and then. They also noted her extensive experience in wilderness survival, leading them to believe that she was still alive and the search needed to continue on, which it did. Based on the various sightings, they still remained optimistic about her being alive, even towards the end of their efforts on the 19th of July. There isn't a lot of information regarding her family or what they thought might have happened, but one idea suggests that the events of 2020 and the isolation enforcement that was in effect may have significantly impacted her mental health. Early on, many people were uncertain and very anxious about getting ill, and what the severity of it might be. Is it possible that Sandra was experiencing personal or mental health issues because of this? Let's be honest, society was being constantly bombarded with a lot of bad news. I could imagine some taking this very badly. This is obviously all speculation at this point, but you could look to the unusual behaviour noted at her campsite and at the moment of the sightings where she declined help despite clearly needing it. This idea would then suggest that because of everything that was happening in the world, it could have caused her to suffer a mental break. It is possible, I suppose, that she might have become so fearful of becoming infected that she started avoiding people, possibly refusing help or contact altogether. For most people, we look back at that time and realise how odd it all was in hindsight and are able to move on from it. But at the extremes, we don't really know how badly it might have affected some people. It is possible that Sandra could be a case of this. Another popular hypothesis suggests, as law enforcement seem to consider, that her car crash had caused the mental issues that seem to be present in this case. The issue with that is that you then have to take the position that the state of her campsite is completely separate from the mental issues that she may have been having. As mentioned previously, the accident in the car can't have helped one bit, but that was not where this episode looks to have begun, as that was 2 days after the campsite discovery. Although with that being said, it could be that the two incidents are separate, as briefly touched on earlier. It could have been that she was in fight or flight mode and fled the campsite for some other reason that we don't know. or had just become hair at the campsite for some reason. One searcher speculated that she might have come across something that she was not supposed to see. This individual stated, "I participated in the search a few weeks ago. I'm very familiar with the area, having hiked it for years. There are numerous places where someone could easily get lost. However, many aspects of this case are just strange. I started to think she might have stumbled upon a grow operation and was disappeared. The crash and sightings could then have been a part of an attempt to sweep the incident under the rug to make it look like she'd just gotten lost. Apparently, there have been numerous grow operations in the area over the years. It wouldn't surprise me given the condition of her campsite and where her car was found." The problem with this is that based on the reporting, there are separate groups of witnesses, one of whom, a motorist or motorists, who had seen Sandra walking away from the crash site, and another group of hikers had seen her barefoot near the trailhead, who'd both seen her on the 4th of July. You would have to make the case that the motorist witnesses were lying, which doesn't seem to be the case. The group of hikers who'd spotted her barefoot were also deemed as credible. Not only that, but then you have to try and make everything else make sense around it. If this entire incident was as a result of Sandra seeing something she wasn't supposed to, and then said people caused her to disappear, why on earth would they go ahead and trash the campsite and the car? All that serves to do is to make the situation look more suspicious, and less like someone who just wandered away into the wilderness and gotten lost. Many people have since disagreed with that whole hypothesis too, arguing that grow-ups usually aim to stay completely under the radar. The idea being that if someone was to stumble upon them, they typically avoid confrontation rather than taking them and causing harm to them, which would attract law enforcement attention and jeopardise the entire grow operation. You could also add to that and suggest that the people involved in this theoretical growing situation would probably not then go ahead and contact the authorities themselves describing some intricate situation of a car crash they'd done themselves, and then also spotting her at the trailhead. Even if someone had done those things, it's difficult to imagine that they'd then go and talk to the police about it. Another line of thought that I've seen suggested was that her camp and her car could have been ransacked by opportunistic strangers looking for valuables after they were abandoned for a few days. Certainly possible, I suppose, but these are very remote areas, and for that to have happened twice, miles apart, I'm not sure. The final hypothesis suggests that she simply got lost and there was no third party involvement, one person stated. This happened about 3 minutes away from where I live. Parts of the Sierra are rugged, rocky and dry this time of year. It's also a somewhat eerie area in my experience. According to a local news station, her personal items were found at Johnson Meadows. If she took the route I know through Fresno Dome, that's a remote area with narrow dirt roads. It's very isolated and not a popular spot. She could have easily gotten lost, especially since she had recently moved to California and wasn't familiar with the terrain. Looking at the map, you can see how remote it is. It's easy to get lost and not be found there. Every sighting that was reported of Sandra was plausible. Sandra had excellent survival skills and knowledge of the outdoors, so the reported sighting a month after her disappearance is also certainly a possibility. With the survival skills that Sandra had, she did have the know-how to survive for a month in the woods if she had access to water, which she'll have known how to find. The hunters also reported that she appeared thinner than in her photos, which would make sense if she'd been surviving for a month in the wilderness. However, what doesn't make sense is why she didn't call out for help. If you'd been in the wilderness for a month trying to survive, surely you'd reach out for help as soon as you came across another person. It's very difficult to imagine a mental break like this enduring for over a month without any interruptions at all, though not impossible, I suppose. You could also argue that maybe it wasn't a mental break, and instead she'd just suffered a quite bad head injury in the car, and now she was just deeply confused and displaying avoidant behaviours from which she was not recovering. Though again, the car crash came after the campsite abandonment, so you just run into the problem of trying to explain that, or I suppose have to reason that she had sustained the head injury sometime before the crash at the campsite. It's also worth pointing out that before her disappearance, Sandra made some big changes in her life in terms of the fact that she just had this big move to California. She'd also dyed her hair, which according to reports was unusual for her, and with the whole world going into chaos at that time, perhaps she was behaving erratically. It's certainly possible that she was in the midst of a breakdown. Again, this is all speculation, but her fundamental survival instincts could have still been functioning, allowing her to continue surviving out in the wilderness, albeit in a distressed, disoriented and confused state. The state of the campsite really confuses things here, because as gone over, you could make the case that when Sandra crashed her car, she perhaps hit her head, leaving her disoriented. She could have suffered a concussion, which could help to explain her behaviour. This, coupled with insufficient gear, a lack of adequate food and water, this scenario could be plausible. However, it's important to note that the authorities stated that the car had minimal damage, suggesting it had been travelling at a slow speed, likely below 20 miles per hour before colliding with the tree. The real problem though, is that you then have to come up with a different explanation for the campsite, because that was found 2 days before the crash. Perhaps, as per the bruising to her face, she was suffering from a head injury, but it wasn't caused by the crash. Could it have been caused by something that happened at the campsite? Perhaps she set up the campsite, something separate happened there which caused her to flee and hit her head? She got lost, but because of her skill set remained calm and then got to the car sometime later, but then crashed it while in this state of confusion. Given the bruise on her face, if this was in fact as a result of the crash or something at the campsite, she could have been suffering cognitively, quite severely, even without any visible evidence left behind in the car. If she wasn't wearing a seatbelt and collided with the tree at 20 miles per hour, the impact could have been more significant than we realise. Even without deploying the airbags, hitting her head on the steering wheel could definitely have caused a concussion or made a pre-existing injury worse. Building on that, maybe she did have the clarity to gather some essentials and a change of clothes, still intending to reach Yosemite. Even if her plan was irrational, she might have been operating on autopilot, driven by a pre-concussion plan that she came up with initially. She may have reached the spot where her sleeping bag was found, confirming that she'd been right at the border of Yosemite, at least at some point. Going back to the extraordinary for a moment, there is a lot of folklore and stories of strange activity within the surrounding area, with some locals believing the area is haunted. The Native Americans claim that the forest was inhabited by spirits and other such things. They describe that these spirits protect the land, and if they believe it's being mistreated, they become vengeful and will punish the person for their perceived mistreatment. There are also a number of Native American stories about lights being seen in the forest, which they interpret as spirits either leading someone to safety or astray. Whether you take this kind of folklore seriously or not, the experience reported by the Gorber family is certainly unnerving, but it could just be a case of a 3-year-old saying something weird, as does happen with toddlers. Obviously, we can never be sure, but it's certainly odd. It's important to point out too that very young persons don't tend to lie in the same way that older children or adults do. A more developed person can lie to deceive, while young persons don't really do that. Their lies are often more simple and based around wishful thinking. Like, a toddler might have cookie crumbs around their mouth, and when asking if they're the one that ate the cookie in a certain tone, they might deny it. It's hard to imagine someone that young concocting an intricate lie like this. Caden certainly seems to believe that he'd seen someone, or I suppose maybe it wasn't a lie at all and it was just some fanciful play on his behalf. Who knows? Either way, while Caden's account is undeniably peculiar and unsettling, the sighting reported by the hunters over a month after Sandra's disappearance is also bizarre. The hunters claimed that she was 15 to 20 feet off the road, staring into space, with no gear and no one around on a remote forest road. Authorities had been searching for her for over a month and had found nothing in regards to where Sandra might have gone. And yet, these two hunters reported seeing her east of where the car was found. How did any of this happen? If that was her, it's bizarre that she'd managed to evade the search parties for all that time. With a potential head injury, no shoes, no sleeping bag, food or gear, she then managed to travel another 5 miles south of where the sleeping bag was towards the observation site. It's unbelievable, and in the end, there are still many unanswered questions. Sandra is still missing, and to this day has never been found. What do you make of this? I'm going to end it there. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and do drop me a comment as I read pretty much all of them. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.